last four sets of notes a little differently than we did the civil rights. Instead of doing it by topic, we're going to do by decade. So we're going to do the 70s, we'll do the 80s, the 90s, and then the 2000s to finish up. So starting with 70s, I got it broken down by year with a couple events that happened each year that are of importance. Starting in 1970, in the spring, you have a campus protest at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, where there were fatalities. This is largely considered to be the most violent of your campus protests of the Vietnam era. If you talk to the students, the Ohio National Guard fired on them. If you talk to the Ohio National Guard, they just returned fire. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, but this protest concerning the Vietnam War and the escalation of the war in the early 70s is considered to be the most violent of your campus protests. Moving on to 1971, you have a new amendment on the books. That's the 26th Amendment. This lowers the voting age from 21 years to 18 years old. Obviously, with 2020 being an election year, this has a great deal of effect on the voting populace. In 1972, you have three things that I've listed here. First, Nixon goes on his Journey for Peace trip. China had been communist since the 1920s, and there had been no diplomatic relations between the U.S. and the Chinese for the better part of 50 years. Nixon is your first president to visit China and has meetings with Mao Zedong, who is the leader of Red China. In the summer, June 17th to be specific, you have the Watergate scandal that begins. Nixon and his re-election team commissioned or hired 4 men that were called the Plumbers to break into Democratic National Headquarters, which were housed in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. What they were supposed to do was steal Democratic Party campaign materials or secrets to ensure that Nixon is going to get reelected, and that should say 1972, not 1974. If you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, there is a scene in Forrest Gump where he is looking out of his hotel window at an office building at night, and he sees, flashlights in an office. That is supposed to symbolize the Watergate break-in. In the winter of 72, you had the 1972 presidential election. Nixon is going to win easily over George McGovern, who is the Democratic challenger. Nixon gets 60% of the popular vote to McGovern's 40%. In 1973, you have probably one of the most famous or infamous, depending on how you want to look at it, Supreme Court cases, and that's Roe v. Wade. This said that a woman cannot be prevented by a state from having an abortion during the first 6 months of the pregnancy. Anytime you hear the abortion issue, it always comes back to the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court case. In the fall of 73, Nixon, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned. Spiro Agnew had been the VP, and he resigns amid tax evasion and bribery charges. This is another black mark on the Nixon administration because you're already in the middle of the Watergate scandal. Spiro Agnew will be replaced by Gerald Ford as the vice president. In 1974, May 7th specifically, impeachment hearings begin against Nixon. This does not mean he was impeached. It means the call for impeachment hearings have come about. No vote was ever taken to formally impeach him. The main reason is Watergate, or the obstruction of justice, basically hiding evidence, and preventing investigators and, the judicial branch from doing their job. A lot of it comes down to tapes that Nixon recorded of meetings in his Oval Office that, were his undoing. Later that summer, July 27th, the actual articles of impeachment are formally recommended against Nixon. Okay? Remember, even though they have recommended them, there has not been an impeachment trial. Nixon will resign before any of this happens. That is on August 9th when he resigns the presidency, and he is the only president ever to do so. In his televised speech when he resigns, He says, my judgments were wrong, my political base in Congress was lost. He never admits any wrongdoing. He never takes fault in anything. He just basically says he has lost the trust of the government and the people and can no longer do his job. Gerald Ford, who is the vice president, will assume the presidency, and he becomes a trivia question because Gerald Ford is the only person that was never elected to the vice presidency or the presidency to serve as president. He will pardon Nixon of all crimes in September of 1974, and will finish out Nixon's term until the 1976 election. Now, with impeachment, there are 3 presidents that have been impeached. The first is Andrew Johnson, right at the end of the Civil War. It had to do with the firing of the Secretary of War without congressional approval. He was acquitted of that by 1 vote and remained as president. The second president to be impeached was Bill Clinton, which we'll talk about in a few days. He resoundingly was kept as president. And then the third one is Donald Trump, which, obviously we have lived through within the last calendar year. Richard Nixon was never impeached. He resigned before that could happen. He would have been impeached. He would have been voted out of office, but he got out of Dodge before any of that took place. 1975, going back to the end of the Vietnam War, the communists take South Vietnam. They capture the capital city of Saigon, and they rename it Ho Chi Minh City after the communist leader. In 1976, that's the bicentennial of the United States of America. That 200th birthday party takes place on July 4th. And then you have a presidential election in November of 76. Your Republican is Gerald Ford, who is the incumbent president. Generally is thought to be a very good person, well-liked, but was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Your Democrat is Jimmy Carter, who's the governor of Georgia. He is going to win a close election in the Electoral College and will serve as president from 1976 to 1980. In 1977, little pop culture. The movie Star Wars debuts in theaters and becomes the highest grossing film of all time. The original 3 Star Wars, you'll have the Star Wars, you'll have The Empire Strikes Back, and then you'll have The Return of the Jedi. In 1978, Senate signs a bill that is going to transfer power and control of the Panama Canal to the country of Panama. That control will be passed on December 31st, 1999. And in the decade, in 1979, you have 3 Mile Island, which is a nuclear accident in Pennsylvania, where nuclear reactors melted down and were not under control. It is the largest nuclear power accident in history and was considered the largest in the world until Chernobyl in the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s. The last thing about 1979, and this will bleed into the 1980 election, is the Iran hostage scandal, which started on November 4th. You have 63 Americans that were taken hostage at the American embassy in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran, and will be held hostage through the inauguration day 1981 when Ronald Reagan becomes the president. This will be the major issue of the 1980 presidential election between Jimmy Carter, who tried his best to get them released and could not, and he will ultimately be defeated in 1980 by Ronald Reagan, who is actually able to negotiate the release of the hostages in the Iran hostage crisis. With all this, you have a 1970s review assignment that's on formative. Make sure you get that complete, and we will move on with a little bit more Vietnam stuff later this week.